Good morning. During this series of Lent, Rachel just mentioned we're in the 5th week of it, we have been traveling looking for Jesus. We've called the series The Man of Sorrows, and we've done a deep dive into suffering over the last month or so. We've looked at following Jesus in the misery of the world that we experience around us and in us. We've remembered the presence and the comfort of our Lord who suffered. We've looked at Job and some of the human and unanswerable questions that Job asks about God's sovereignty and suffering. And today we're turning together to the letter of 2 Timothy for clues about the tangible help that we offer to each other when we suffer. I'll read some verses from 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting on page 1851. 2 Timothy 1, verse 15, and then we'll be flipping over the page to chapter 4. Timothy says to Paul, or Paul says to Timothy, wow. Try again. You know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day. You know very well in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. And we're turning the page over to chapter 4, starting at verse 9. Timothy, do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia, and only Luke is still with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments. And then down to the final verses at verse 19. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you, and so do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. The Lord be with your spirit, and grace be with you all. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you're here in the sanctuary or following the order of worship online, you've all seen the title of this morning's sermon, Onesiphorus, who refreshed me. And this week, if you had been a fly on the wall of the church office, you would have seen me scurrying around, double and triple checking that I spelled Onesiphorus's name properly for the bulletin. Because there's a lot of vowels in there. I double and triple checked. Where do they all go, and how does this name fit together? And who exactly is Onesiphorus? Have you ever heard a sermon about Onesiphorus? Have you ever read about him in a storybook Bible for children? Or read his name in a who's who list of New Testament Christians? He shows up only in 2 Timothy and only in the little sections that we read together today. But nevertheless, there's something about his ministry that stands out for the Apostle Paul enough to elevate him as an example in this book. Why is that? Well, for one thing, Onesiphorus comes to Paul at a time of emotional freight in his life. Paul is in desperate circumstances. His life and career in ministry have never been easy, but at the point we pick up with Paul's letter today, things are especially difficult. Paul is imprisoned, chained to a Roman guard. He is powerless to change his situation at all. he's in a place where nearly everyone who is close to him is not around. Everyone but Luke is gone. Some of his friends have deserted him. Others are sick. Still others he's sent to other places in the Roman Empire to serve the church. And if that weren't enough, to add to the stress of being imprisoned, Paul fully expects that his time on this earth is growing short. In chapter 4, in part of the section that we didn't read, Paul says, "I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. The time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith." So in this letter, parts of it read like a last will and testament. Paul's final instructions are coming, drafted from Rome, sent 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean Sea to Timothy, whom Paul has stationed in Ephesus to care for the church there. Timothy's supposed to be modeling and preaching the gospel in the face of false teaching and practice that are infiltrating and filtering through the church. So Paul doesn't have a lot of autonomy, doesn't have a lot of control over his life right now, but the power that he has, his voice and his pen, he uses. He lets people know what's happening. He asks those who love him and love Jesus for their help, their continued faithfulness to the gospel. He asks Timothy to come soon, before the winter. He wants Timothy to make a stop in Troas to pick up his coat, because winter's coming, and he's going to get cold. And in that request to Timothy, Paul also sends his greetings to the family of Onesiphorus. Onesiphorus is known to Timothy for the ministry that he fulfilled in Ephesus, the many ways he helped Paul. By highlighting Onesiphorus' ministry and the genuine help that it gave to Paul and to the church there, Paul is raising up this example, hoping that Timothy will do the same thing. "Timothy, please, won't you come and visit me too? I need your help now. In fact, I could have used your company yesterday. So I'm sending Tychicus to Ephesus so he can take care of the church. You come to Rome, dear son, and be with me." Until Timothy can come, Paul is heartened and encouraged and strengthened by this memory of Onesiphorus' visit. "Onesiphorus often refreshed me," Paul writes. "He was not ashamed of my chains, and on the contrary, he searched hard for me until he found me when he came to Rome." When Onesiphorus comes to Rome, he wears out the pavement. He knocks on every door, seeks out every bystander. His love for Paul and for his cause in the cause of Jesus overpowers whatever natural fear Paul might have had, Timothy might have had, of being suspected because of his affiliation with Paul, someone who is in prison. Yes, he would say, "I'm looking for Paul. Paul, originally of Tarsus. We understand that he's under arrest, staying somewhere here in the city. Yes, I will leave my contact information. If you hear anything, would you let me know?" And once Onesiphorus has followed up every lead and knocked on every door, finally found the right house, he greets Paul with relief and concern. And he gives Paul a squinty-eyed once-over. Has Paul lost weight? Look at the bags under his eyes. How can he sleep chained up to a guard? And that dirty tray over in the corner over there, is that all the food that's in the house? If it is, Onesiphorus will find out. And if it is, he will do something about it. When he gets back from the market and Paul has eaten something, Onesiphorus looks at Paul again with different eyes. How's Paul's spirit doing? Did Paul know that not everybody in the province of Asia where Ephesus was, not all of those people had forgotten about him? Did Paul need to hear and experience again the message that he had preached and lived for other people? That Jesus had died, Jesus had risen, and Jesus was coming again. And the reality of what Jesus was up to was bigger than the four walls of Paul's house. In Onesiphorus' visits, we see a few qualities of care that are worth emulating in our own concern about each other. I'm going to highlight three. First, Onesiphorus' help is characteristic of him. Paul says Onesiphorus refreshed him, not just once, but often. His companionship to Paul over in Rome seems to have been completely of a piece, totally consistent with the kind of ministry that people saw and knew and experienced with him in the church in Ephesus. And so when Timothy reads this letter and sees that Onesiphorus has sought out Paul, searching hard for him, we could imagine Timothy nodding over this letter and saying, of course Onesiphorus looked for you. Of course it was Onesiphorus at your door. Anyone who knows him might expect exactly that. Number two, Onesiphorus' help honors Paul, honors Paul's ministry, honors Paul's humanity. While Onesiphorus recognizes the seriousness of Paul's imprisonment, he's not ashamed of it. He's not afraid that his reputation will be tarnished by befriending a man who has done so much to teach him. He honors Paul through his diligent searching, through his company, through his respect. Number three, Onesiphorus' help is soul restoring. This part's important. It's soul restoring, even though Onesiphorus is completely powerless to change anything about Paul's situation. It could be possible for Onesiphorus or any other person to look at Paul's imprisonment and pending trial and expected consequences, to look at all of that and throw up their hands and say, what good can one friend do? What good can one little guy in a prison house do for his friend? Onesiphorus cannot appeal to Caesar on Paul's behalf. He cannot represent him at trial. He's not going to stage a jailbreak. And yet, despite the total inability that Onesiphorus has to affect any change in Paul's circumstances, Paul says Onesiphorus' ministry truly refreshes him. He often refreshed me. Refreshed as in a cool breeze blowing on a warm day. Refreshed me like water gently flowing over parched ground. Refreshed me like a home-cooked meal plus dessert when you haven't eaten for a day. Onesiphorus' refreshment was life to a man on death row. It isn't too strong to say that Onesiphorus was a godsend for Paul. The refreshment that Onesiphorus brings to that prison cell is nothing less than the help of God. The kind of help that Onesiphorus gives Paul is like the help of those who refreshed a seminarian named Roger Nelson. Roger was a seminary student about 40 years ago. He worked at Roseland Christian Ministries in the south side of Chicago. And on this day, March 17, 39 years ago, his parents and his wife-to-be came to the church where he was doing some worship leadership, where he was staffing a shelter for people who were unhoused. And they had a beautiful morning together in worship. And as the Nelsons left, worship that day, they were approached by a man with a gun and ordered into their car. Roger's knowledge and experience in that neighborhood served him well. He was able to respond calmly and with skill in that tense situation. But just when the family thought that things were getting settled down, that in just a moment or two they would be on to realize what had happened and move forward with their day, Roger's father, Ron, was killed. After his dad's funeral, Roger returned to the seminary classroom in a fog. Author Jeff Monroe tells this story. He says, Roger would often sit in class feeling dazed, with tears in his eyes. He does recall being helped by two of his professors, one who had recently lost a son to suicide. He moved toward Roger empathically. The professor's own loss was too recent, and he couldn't find words. But Roger felt the comfort of his caring presence, and he felt that this man knew what Roger was feeling. Monroe goes on to talk about a second professor. That professor had slowly and agonizingly lost a 20-year-old to cancer, 20-year-old son to cancer, a few years earlier. That professor, too, approached Roger and stopped him in the hall to express his sympathy. He then told Roger that at the time of his son's death, he thought that even if God himself were to appear and write down the reasons for the professor's son's death on a piece of paper, he would crumple up the paper and throw it away. No explanation could make what happened seem right. At one point, the pastor of the church where Roger had spent some time earlier in his life made a 2.5-hour drive across the state of Michigan to see Roger. We walked along the pier at Lake Michigan, Roger said. I don't remember what we talked about. I just remember that he cared. He was present. He made an effort to see me. I thought, this is what it means to be a pastor. And I knew what I wanted to do. Roger did go on to become a pastor, and in fact, he's still a pastor of a congregation in Illinois. During that season, so many people were onesiferouses for Roger, doing what they could, offering what they had to give. No one could change a thing about his circumstances. No one could bring his father back. No one could spare Roger the pain of rehearsing that story and that event over and over and seeking healing. But those people, they could show up. I have a question for you. What might have happened if all of those who came alongside Roger had stayed away? What might have happened if professors processing their own pain had been blind to his? What if those who approached Roger thought that what they had to give wasn't really worth sharing or wasn't enough in such a situation? Roger would have walked alone through that painful journey. His soul might have shriveled, but he didn't walk alone. And his soul didn't shrivel. Instead, one professor came up to him in the hallway and poured out a cup of empathy on the water-starved roots of his soul. The other professor brought his honest God questions to Roger and shone sunlight on fragile blooms. The pier walk with Roger's former pastor sent a refreshing breeze over drooping branches. And the Holy Spirit himself tended the garden of Roger's soul. Slowly, gently, by these and 1,000 other nameless acts of love, Roger knew the care of his God. And over a period of time, his soul was refreshed. Dr. Daniel Rooks, who is not related to Dean and Tina as far as I know, but I'll have to ask you after the service. Daniel Rooks is a psychologist who has worked with people who have gone through the criminal justice system. Jeff Monroe interviewed him about the effect of the Christian community's care for Roger to get a psychologist's perspective on that. Dan said, the people who expressed empathy to Roger saved him. I know that's a strong statement. They saved him from where the pain may have taken him otherwise. When someone else steps into our pain and suffering, when they aren't afraid to come in with care, that's huge. Care is less about saying the right thing, more about just showing up. On Christian Education Sunday, as you think about the people who have shown up as Onesiphorus in your own life, maybe the faces of teachers or coaches or school mentors flash across your mind. Maybe you picture siblings or parents or friends or neighbors or other church members with whom you've bravely, thoughtfully shared challenges. Your everyday angst, as well as those crisis moments that divide the world into before and after. I suspect that for most of us in the drama of life, we would rather be cast as Onesiphorus, who comes to provide support, who comes to show help, who comes to be the face of Christ. We'd rather do that than we would be the person like Paul, who's suffering and asking for support. But if someone like the Apostle Paul, who spread the good news to the whole known world, who suffered for Christ in ways I will never know, probably, if that Paul can acknowledge weakness and fear and a need for the company of his friend, the way he does, hints at here, but does in stronger terms in 2 Corinthians, we can share our suffering too. And so I wonder, what if it were as usual for us in the Christian church to be equally at home in both of the roles? Equally at home as Onesiphorus bringing help, as we are as Paul asking for help. How would our relationships with each other, the mutuality that we would experience, be different? When we neither glory in nor deny our needs and our vulnerabilities, we get a front row seat to watch God's Spirit work. When we're Paul, our flagging bodies and tired spirits receive strength for this day. When we're Onesiphorus, we look to our life-giving Lord. We look like our life-giving Lord, who searches and finds and inquires and helps and nurtures and brings us life. Jesus himself came to visit this life. He came to visit us. He came into the cold of this world. He came to live inside the pains of our bodies and the fatigue of our spirits. He sits with anguished souls under shadow of arrest, under shadow of impending trial. He hears the lonely prayers in the dark, and then he goes to the cross, taking a long road that nobody else can walk for us. And after 3 days, he rises in glory, proof that we too, who are in him, will rise, souls and bodies refreshed, resurrected, restored for a life that's really life. Thanks be to God.